How many times do females get stepped over for promotions because they're a female and they go the other direction? It's unfortunately this happens. Unfortunately, we still need a lot of work, and with the everything going on with the movements around this country and around the world, we need to have these frank discussions. We need to talk about it. We need to find out why this continues on, and I do take pride that I've promoted more minorities and women into commissioners and deputy commissioners positions in the history of county government, but we still need to do more. We still need to do more, and it's just the beginning. So I look forward to this discussion today with these panelists, and I look forward to hearing from people in the audience of what we can do differently.
In February 2017, Senator Elizabeth Warren raised serious objections to Jeff Sessions' confirmation to U.S. Attorney General. While this began as an attempt to silence and shame one woman, nevertheless, she persisted, has become a rallying cry for women everywhere to break down barriers despite a history of being silenced and ignored. In our culture, women are too commonly shushed and disregarded. We are too often told to be quiet. We are reminded that we would really be so much more pleasing if we would smile a little more, talk a little less, or work a little harder to be pliant and agreeable. But as Laurel Thatcher Ulrich said, well-behaved women rarely make history. And I'd like to think that we have a room full of women who are making history. Now is the time for us to reclaim our voices. I am the director of the Albany County Crime Victim and Sexual Violence Program. We have the privilege of helping sexual assault and domestic violence victims, long considered private and shameful secrets, find their voice and their power. We are working to change our communities from a victim-blaming rape culture to a culture of accountability. This type of violence isn't a woman's issue, it's our collective issue. I can speak for my agency, Crime Victims, that the New York State Enough is Enough legislation and the Me Too movement have significantly impacted the number of calls we get on our sexual assault crisis hotline. When I first joined Crime Victims, we had an average of 8 emergency room accompaniments a month. We're now averaging 8 a weekend and sometimes 2 or more in a 24-hour period. I don't think we're having more assaults. I think more women are coming forward. More women believe they will be heard, they will be believed, and that we will do something for them. So I think it's encouraging that we're having these numbers. A little alarming, but encouraging. I had some questions, and then Mary challenged me to come up with more interesting questions. So this is very much about Me Too, discrimination, inclusivity, and pay inequality. So starting with, and this is for any and all members of our panel, what's your big idea right now that addresses intersectionality and violence in our communities?
I think it's really important when you're talking about intersectionality to really think about how we are bringing together not just students but all of us across the different experiences, but they may have some shared solutions. And in the Schenectady walkout, the students really spoke a lot to the causes that they see of violence in their communities, in their families, in their school, and they felt a lot like it's due to just for their experience, the just need to survive every day as opposed to a feeling of hope and long-term future. And people sometimes, in their situations, they've seen peers resort to violence because all that counts is getting through the day. And that's where I think, for me, that really speaks to what are we doing to invest in our youth, in our communities, and in really creating the opportunities and path to a long-term future and to a hope for a long-term future. And for Citizen Action, that comes a lot down to why we focus so much on quality education, making sure that our schools and every one of our cities and towns and communities has the resources it needs to meet the needs of students.
A person's identities really not only shape their experience with violence, our multiple identities, right? So I'm a white, cisgender, straight, female, okay? That makes me different than other women because of those other identities. And so those differing identities make us experience violence differently, but it also makes the response to a disclosure of violence different. So I have seen responses from various different folks charged with responding to violence differ from the identities of the folks who are disclosing to them. And I guess if I had to have one big idea on this issue, it would be to just start talking about this, right? So folks, I think, may not really understand the way our differing identities affect our experiences with violence and how folks respond to it. I think that many folks don't understand when we say intersectionality what we mean. So I think what we really need to start with is educating people about how these different identities affect our lives on a daily basis, especially when it comes to our experiences with violence.
So I don't necessarily have a big idea to address the intersectionality and violence. However, I know in the population that we represent, we see a lot of violence in a certain subset of people. So it's probably what you would all expect. We see 20s-ish Black males who come from a certain community. So my only recommendation would be to address these issues early, because what I tend to see is people who have kind of a hardened sense of a hardened life. They are very insensitive to violence. It doesn't necessarily affect them. They seem to be oftentimes cold to it. So if we can backtrack and have them earlier say, this is not okay, this is how it affects, if they see their parents fighting or their dad hit their mom, or even vice versa more often now, they kind of grow up with this idea that that's okay. So when it gets to our end, they're not apologetic about it, and they don't necessarily see that it's wrong. So I think we need to step back and start earlier and say, and educating, I spend a lot of time with youth, because they need to know that this is not okay. This is, something that long-term will affect you, it'll affect your community, it'll affect your children.
So given the fact that a lot of our young people have been victims of violence, a lot of our young people feel disenfranchised and feel that the systems aren't about them and aren't able to help them. What can we do better to organize across communities so that we work more effectively?
We need to have the communities outside of those who are affected the most realize that this is an issue. The biggest problem that I see is the lack of understanding and the lack of identification with the communities who are the least affected. If we don't have the communities around this particular group recognize and help address the problems, it's always going to stay in that community, because nobody outside of it cares enough to do anything about it. And the group that's in it itself, I think they just don't know how to get out of it, or they don't want to get out of it oftentimes. So if we could have the larger society come together and help these people, it would make a huge difference.
One of my priorities when I joined the university, in doing the work that I was charged to do, which is to coordinate our institutional response to sexual violence, was to look outside the university and to create partnerships with folks in the broader community, right? So folks like Karen at Albany County Crime Victim Sexual Violence Center, the people at the Legal Project, the New York State Police, the Albany Police. And what we did is we all came together to serve that one population, the students at UAlbany. And we were working, with the different stakeholders within the university and outside the university. We sat down and we just listened to each other. And we all had a common goal, and that was to improve the university's responses and the community's responses to sexual and interpersonal violence in the population that we were serving, and those were our students. And we sat down and we listened to each other and we worked together. We do trainings together. We share our successes together. And that just conversation, that kind of breaking down of the silos, right, that we see within organizations and outside of organizations is so important to getting this work done, because none of us can do it on our own. We shouldn't be doing it on our own, because when you're in it, like Sherry said, you can't always identify what the real barriers are to change. But if you bring in other folks, you listen to each other, you are respectful to each other, I think progress can be made, and we saw that at UAlbany.
What I've learned over the years is that you can think you're working across lines, you can think you're bringing communities together, but it's kind of, if it's at a very superficial level, it doesn't really change the systemic problems that we're up against. And you have to figure out how you really change the patterns in your own work in order to even begin to challenge the patterns that systemic racism and patriarchy and corporate greed are creating in our society. And so over the years, gotten more and more intentional about making sure that we're lifting up the voices, first of all, of people that are directly impacted, and secondly, that we're making sure that we're lifting up voices of women and of people of color in the leadership of our organization, of our organizing, because without that, the kind of diverse look is just a look. It's not a reality in terms of power and decision-making and where the ideas come from and all those kinds of other things that really are necessary for changing systems.
Let's get to the wage gap, because I know that's absolutely on the minds of our legislature and a lot of other people as well. So white women are paid about 81% of white men. Black women are paid 65%, and Latinx women are paid about 59%. This affects every aspect of their present and future. For example, it affects their ability to afford safe housing, maintain reliable transportation, and accumulate wealth against adversity. What remedies do you recommend to employers around implicit bias and how to address its impact?
Unconscious bias, implicit bias, means that people don't know they have bias. So you have to start with teaching them that although you think you're not in your everyday life making decisions based on biases that have maybe existed within you from the time that you were a child, that you don't recognize, don't understand, they have to be brought to light. And the only way that you can do that is through some really good education. It's not something that can be done just by folks like me who have no experience in it. It's something that we need to take seriously as a community, as a society, to start to recognize that we all have bias, that our culture and our workplaces are shaped by the implicit or unconscious biases of the folks that are making decisions in the workplace, and we need to expose them. Once we've recognized what our biases are in whatever institution we're working or whoever we are and whatever role we play in that institution, we have to figure out how to address those biases.
I think it's important in any business, institution, agency, that we have systems that do the best that a system can do to protect against bias, because bias is going to, as you said, bias is going to come into it. People are unconscious of it. The world isn't changing that fast, unfortunately. And so we have to create systems that, like standard pay scales, where it's clear what the criteria are for different pay levels, and this is something that government is a little better at sometimes than the rest of us. But things that create objective criteria that are harder for bias. I mean, bias still comes into everything, but things that make it a little harder for biases to make decisions, because things are more objective and more objectively based in decision-making around things like salary and promotions. And also, I think it's really important that every employer have a system for really regularly and systematically assessing where they're at. People don't want to look at this, but really look at what are the pay rates of your white staff versus your staff of color, and are they comparable or not? What are the pay rates of your women versus your men? Are they comparable or not? And if they're not, what is the reason for that? And usually it's, people are at lower level jobs versus higher level jobs, and then what's the reason for that? And then having really systematic plans for how to overcome that.
I guess my perspective is a little bit different in that I don't think a lot of times it is unconscious. I think it's a very conscious decision to pay a certain group of people more money because you value them more than you do other groups. So it's very easy for me. For instance, I'm the head of the office. I can take A attorney, B attorney, and say they have the exact same job. Why do they make different amounts of money if one is a white male and one is a black female? I guess the obvious answer is they shouldn't. So it would be easy for me, not necessarily, in this position, but in a private company to say they should be paid the same amount, they do the same amount of work, and they do equally as good of a job. So if that is not the case, there's a reason for that, and it's a reason that you chose not to pay them the same amount of money. So I don't know how we address that, particularly in private companies, because it's their right to say, no, I don't want to pay this black female as much as I pay this white male, because, again, they don't value the black female as much as they do as the white male, and that's a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. It's going to take a lot to start addressing that. It's going to take employers to stand up and say, this is what we're going to do, and hopefully a trend will start after that for more people to follow that.
Albany County is working on an equity agenda. We're working very closely with you, Albany, on having an equity agenda. And I think that's really exciting for us. one of the things when I was doing some research on equity agendas was really involving people from the community at the most basic and earliest part of our work. So when we're creating budgets, when we're looking at our mission statements and our vision and value statements. So let me throw it out to you. How could we invite more people from the community, particularly marginalized communities, to be having a more integral role in the development and formation of our work when they may not trust us, and they have reason not to trust us?
Generally speaking, you know, our clients think that we don't work for them, that, you know, they don't trust us, that we're working with the DAs, we're working with the judges, which is absolutely not the case. But it's, you know, an uphill battle trying to explain to this person, my job is to represent you. My job is not to make the DA's job easier. It's not to put you in prison. But it's, you know, in the community, people see a system that hasn't worked for them. And, you know, it just takes one client at a time, one case at a time to convince people to say, you know, okay, I see that they are working for us. I see that they are helping us. And you just have to continue to fight the fight and do what you need to do and hope that people will, you know, finally recognize that you are doing what you can to make a difference.
I had a very similar experience when I was working at the DA's office and working with victims of crime who didn't trust, didn't trust that we were going to do the right thing for them. And these were often women who had experienced violence at the hands of someone that they knew and trusted and cared for. And that's a really conflicting place to be, right? So somebody that you love and trust and care for, and most of the crimes that I dealt with and the offenses that I dealt with as a prosecutor, the perpetrator or the accused perpetrator, right, Sherry? The alleged perpetrator was somebody that was known to the victim. And so that person's trust has been shattered by somebody that they knew. And then comes in these strangers, right, usually who did not look like them, okay, and said, trust me, I'm going to do what's best for you. What? How does that even, but that is the system that we're in. And so I think for us, what in the cases where we were successful in working with people who had experienced violence and creating good relationships with them, the key was to just be real and transparent and to listen. And when I say listen, I mean really listen about what was important to them. And if that wasn't important to us, to explain why, but to try and give folks back control. I think that's the most important thing, because a lot of times feelings of distrust come from feelings of lack of control. And so if you go to a community that historically does not trust your program or your role or the organization that you're with, it might be because of this feeling of not having control over what that organization is going to do to affect their lives.
I think a really good example of this is the situation and the ongoing situation that's happened around the oil trains in the South End. So that was an issue where a lot of environmental groups were really concerned about the high volume of oil trains coming into the Port of Albany, and the county executive shared that concern and was very vocal on it. And a lot was being done both with the state, with the feds, with the courts to try to see what could be done to reduce the volume of oil train traffic coming into the Port of Albany. At the same time, a couple of the groups, Sierra Club, Earth Justice, and Citizen Action, started reaching out to the tenants who lived at Ezra Prentice Homes, which is the people who live right next to the tracks where the oil trains are and whose kids play in the playground, but just divided by a little teeny chain link fence from the trains. And those are the people who are directly impacted and who would have the most knowledge of what would make things better for their families and their kids with the presence of that constant oil train traffic and oil train presence in their literal backyard. And that made a big difference in how that whole thing played out, because the Charlene Benton, may she rest in peace, was a credible leader of the Tenants Association at Ezra Prentice, and as our organizer and some of the active people from the other environmental groups who are traditionally white spent time with Ms. Benton and with the tenants at Ezra Prentice and worked with the county executive to come and meet with them as well, and with the mayor and other elected officials. The tenants got a much bigger voice in what was going to happen about the oil train traffic, and also created their own pressure on everybody else to say, say, like, we're not going to accept just, you being out there making speeches. We have to see actual changes. And a lawsuit was filed, and like lots of other things happened. But I think that process of people not assuming that we either as organizing groups or the county executive as an elected official knew all the answers, but actually taking the time to ask people who were living with it every day, what do you think should happen? And to pay attention to that was a really important shift in how things kind of normally happen, both in environmental work and in government.
What would be a call to action to women to facilitate or to try and make that change? And how do you even go about doing that? Talking about it is one thing, but the increase has been, so small over the years. How do you make this happen?
Pay equity gap is currently, is due to sexism and racism in terms of the pay equity gaps are based on race. But it's also harder to change now because of the growing inequality for everybody. I mean, our economy right now is really not working for anybody except for the very rich. And that makes it harder for every piece of the problem to be solved. And so I do think we have to also, at the same time as we're trying to solve the immediate problem of the pay equity gap and make the policy changes and legal requirements to change that, I also think we have to think bolder about what's going to actually make our economy be functional rather than see more and more people in low-wage jobs. And so I think we have to start working for a universal basic income, that everyone has a guaranteed income that's not tied to their job, because we're going to have more and more jobs replaced, we're going to have more and more jobs being very low paid, and if we don't start thinking differently about the future of our economy, we may close the pay gap, but we're all going to be getting paid too little.
So I want to thank you all so much for your time and your inspiration. Each one of us is working as an advocate, an instigator, and a catalyst for change. We have all been given an opportunity to act out of passion and authenticity. This is our time. This is our place. Make no mistake, we are changing the world one person and one act at a time. Thank you.